Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Jack, and today I am going to read an interesting post from Malicious Compliance about how an airline pilot refused a very nice offer my scheduler and demanded more, but in the end had to do the same job without the extra pay offer. So, let's start. Airline pilot refuses my offer and demands more. First, a disclaimer, this is my former co-worker's story and not mine. However, for easy reading, I will tell it in the first person. We work in airline crew scheduling, where our jobs essentially involve ensuring each flight is fully crewed. This requires us to strictly adhere to many rules, including aviation regulations set by the Federal Aviation Administration and collective bargaining agreements (CBAs) upheld by the pilot and flight attendant unions. However, some of the rules in the CBA can be a little flexible, especially when we can offer pilots additional compensation, and they agree to waive specific contractual provisions in exchange. There is a CBA rule for this airline that outlines when and for how long a pilot can be on reserve, a window of time in which they are essentially on call in case we need them to work, and states that if we have an assignment for them, it must start within that window or it's not contractually legal. However, we would frequently offer pilots additional compensation, usually a full day's worth of pay, if they agreed to waive that provision and work trips that start outside of their reserve window. 99% of the time, pilots would accept this additional compensation. Very rarely, in extreme circumstances, we could offer even more pay, sometimes up to 200%, and only if the flight would otherwise be cancelled and cause expensive operational disruptions. I should point out that, while most pilots are fantastic to work with, a certain percentage of them are very arrogant and entitled. It's an attitude that frequently occurs in the pilot population, I don't know why. I've worked in the industry for many years, and the same personality tends to appear quite often, more so at the regional airline level, less so in major or legacy airlines. Anyone else who has worked with pilots before can attest to this. The arrogant attitude is especially pronounced towards crew schedulers, though, because we get to be the bad guys and make them go to work. This story concerns a pilot with this personality who was on reserve. We had a 4-day trip starting in Detroit, DTW, that we needed to find a captain for, but we did not have any DTW-based reserve captains that were legal to work it. The trip started around noon the next day, and it was currently late evening the day prior, about 18 hours before the trip started. There was a captain on reserve at that moment and for the next 4 days, but he was scheduled for evenings, and the trip started outside his reserve window. So, I called him and customarily offered him a full day's extra pay to immediately go to bed and come back the following morning for this trip. He flat out refuses my offer, and then proceeds to tell me I should offer him 200% for the entire trip instead, so basically 4 days of extra pay. I explained that it is against our procedures to offer that much extra pay just to show up early, and even so we would have to offer that level of compensation to other pilots in seniority order first. He adamantly and rudely proclaims that there is no way he is going to work an illegal assignment unless he gets 200%. I say okay and hang up. At that point, I came up with a brilliant plan. I look up our airline's flight schedule and find out there is a late flight leaving soon to go to Tampa, TPA, and a flight the following morning that operates from TPA back to DTW. So, I rebuild the open trip with all the same flights as before, except now it is a 5-day trip that begins with these 2 flights as deadheads. A deadhead is basically a flight that the pilot does not operate. They usually ride with the passengers or in the cockpit jump seat. So he would fly as a passenger to Tampa, stay in a hotel, then fly as a passenger back to DTW just in time to work the flights I had previously asked him to work. The new trip was completely legal per the CBA, and it now started comfortably within this captain's reserve window. So, I assign it to him and call him back. He, of course, is not happy about it. He asks me to change it back and agrees that he will now take the extra day of pay, but I decline. The trip is legal now, and I don't need to change it or offer any extra pay for him to work it. I then ice the cake a bit. I humbly and calmly offer to let him deviate off the scheduled deadheads, which normally means the pilot will not take the deadheads and will instead find their own transportation to the city from which their first operating flight departs, which, in this case, is his home city. I did the math later, and I found that even if he did not deviate, the cost of a non-revenue seat on both flights and paying for a hotel in TPA amounted to less than a full day's pay at his pay rate. There was no additional pay for the longer trip either, since he was getting paid for each of the 5 reserve days anyway. My MC actually saved the company a little money. TLDR, I offer to pay a pilot extra to waive a contract rule and work a trip. He says he won't waive any rules unless he gets an absurd amount of money, more than I'm allowed to give. I make a few changes, and the same amount of work no longer requires him to waive any rules, and he was no longer eligible for any extra pay. His demand didn't fly. Angry upvote. That was terrible. As long as people keep diving into these pun threads, they'll continue to soar. Eventually, though, they'll stall. In the old days, pilots would ingratiate themselves to the scheduling team to get the better routes or those that would suit them with nice layovers. Source: my aunt was a scheduler team lead for Pan Am, and pilots would bring her back gifts to stay in her graces. I guess a lot of this was before current CBA terms existed. Sometimes pilots might bring us donuts or something out of kindness, but the good ones all know that we are numbers people, we can't violate the CBA for them, and we can't knowingly do something that would cost the company more money if there's a better option. I did know a scheduler once that was giving out extra days off in exchange for bribes. He was, of course, fired. Was the bribing pilot fired, too? Nope. You'd be surprised what union protections enable pilots to get away with. If it's a contractual rather than legal prohibition, then it makes sense that the scheduler was breaching some level of fiduciary responsibility to the company, whereas the pilot in that situation was not, as long as it was only a quid pro quo, not some form of negative onus, example, extortion. That is, it's the job of the scheduler to ensure the company is not spending unnecessary amounts of money to have pilots scheduled. The pilot's obligation is entirely on not ruining their own flight window, e.g., getting hammered during their shift. Modest shifts probably wouldn't be a problem. Any traveling salesperson style problem is not going to be, in a reasonable world, optimally solved all the time, but there's usually a reasonable margin. One of my wife's uncles is a pilot for a rather large regional airline here in Australia. By being a decent person and helping when he's needed, his time off and standby days always seem to work really well with plans he has, often off over Christmas and such. Although not actually breaking any rules, his higher-ups will flex things to help him out if he asks. Schedulers always have a handful of pilots who will regularly call in and ask to work extra. They love the extra pay, and we love being able to get trips covered when we have nobody else. When they maintain a positive relationship with us, we will often think of them when trying to cover a trip. What's up with Barry? Is he working today? Maybe he's legal for it, give him a call. I have a really simple set of playbook rules to guide my everyday interactions with others, good, bad, and somewhere in between, most of us. They're all my clients. From those passing my chicken sandwich or salad through the window, my co-workers, our actual clients, to our owner partners. It might sound naive on the surface, but it forces me to look at myself through their eyes. What are they saying? What do they want me to understand? What do they need or want? I have to listen. Arrogance leads me nowhere. I have to ask honest questions. I use the same level of courtesy with all. If this pilot had responded, "Will you please try to think of alternatives and call me back in 10 minutes, he well could have been presented the 5-day mandatory trip, then laughingly accepted the original offer, and bonus, let the scheduler have a win also. Don't get me wrong, I laugh, joke around, participate in regular ways. But there's a fairly high-low bar I avoid like the plague. I think most of us do this. Then there's those who continue to treat others like dirt. Exactly why MC exists. Most pilots understand that when you're offered what is essentially free money, you take it. It's not that hard to work in the morning instead of the afternoon or evening, and for a senior captain at this particular company, one extra day of pay is about $900. Can you imagine turning down an offer to come to work 3 hours earlier and still leave 3 hours earlier for $900, and trying to demand more instead? So the guy is part of a bargaining unit. The agreement with the employer is that pilots don't have to do flights outside of their reserve, and they have a procedure where a pilot can choose to take something on outside of their reserve for additional pay. This is an option that they aren't required to take. The dude said he didn't want to do it, and it was outside his contract, and they punished him for it by fucking around with his schedule, so he had to do it anyway, and they could weasel the company out of paying him for it like they should have. And your coworker felt good about this? The pilot was absolutely a dick for asking for 8x the normal offer at the start, 4 days at 200% bonus versus 1 day at 100% bonus. That said, forcing him onto the schedule and rejecting the 1 day at 100% bonus pay, once the pilot conceded, is also a dick move. We don't know how rude each party was when talking to each other, but regardless, there are no winners here. Well, that was definitely malicious of him, which fits the sub. But it wasn't satisfying or fair. The pilot was just negotiating when he was in the right to do so and refused to take the lowest offer, and your friend ended up punishing him for it. Yay, if I were a pilot, I would be asking for the scheduler's name, marking the time of the call, and contacting a union rep stat. No reason to deadhead a pilot to layover in Tampa, then deadhead back home the next day to work a trip in Detroit when the pilot is based in Detroit. This was a contract violation. I am always as polite and nice as I can be to scheduling. However, they really can throw you for a loop, and it can seem from the crew's side of things that they are taking advantage of you sometimes. Referencing this scenario, they could have told the pilot straight up about his per-show time initially, and if the pilot didn't know this exact rule, they would, of course, comply without knowing any better. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like and subscribe for more daily videos.